Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and it's time to answer more of your questions about how various graphical tricks were achieved in classic games. What kind of amazing effects we're going to see this time around? As we go, why not play along and try to figure out how these effects were done before I get to the answer? How did they do that is as much of a question for you as it is for me, so let's get started. We're starting with a special question for this video because in a first for the channel, a developer of one of these classic games is asking me if I can figure out how he performed a magic trick. Doug Holmes asks, how did he make a 5-colour main sprite on the GBC in Alfred's adventure? I'm not going to chicken out of answering this, so let's do it. Alfred's Adventure was released for the Game Boy Color exclusively in Europe and was basically a colorized remaster of the game Alfred Chicken that was made for the original Game Boy. In order to get a little more context on this question though, we need to briefly look at how the palettes on the Game Boy Color work for native GBC games, of which this is one. If you want to know how the hardware applied color to original Game Boy or DMG games, you can check out this video, where I go into detail about that very subject. So for games made specifically for the Game Boy Color, the hardware provided 8 palettes of 8 colours, 4 palettes for the backgrounds and 4 for sprites. However, the GBC had a limitation of only being able to display 4 colours per tile, so each of the 8 palettes was effectively split in half into 2 smaller palettes of 4 colours each. Only one of these could be used per tile. After accounting for the colours assigned to be transparent, that's a maximum of 56 colours on screen at once. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the sprites for Alfred Chicken. We can see dark red, a brighter red and yellow that make up his body, and white, black and grey that's used for his face. But wait, that's 6 different colours being used on the same sprite. That should be impossible, right? So how did he do this? Let's visualise the actual tiles being used. We can see Alfred's sprite is made up of 7 unique tiles. There's 6 that form his main body, and 1 tile that's actually overlapping some of the others, which is what makes up his face. It is sometimes easy to forget that sprite tiles can actually overlap each other, which is nicely demonstrated on this same screen actually, as we see this enemy pass in front of the balloon, both of which are sprites. So the tile that makes up Alfred's face is using a different palette to the tiles that make up the rest of his body, and clever use of the transparent colours in both of those palettes ensures there's no weird visual glitches. It's pretty neat to implement a standard feature of the hardware in a not so standard way. How'd I do, Doug? Did I get it right? I do need to say I'm always honoured when developers of these classic games find my videos and leave comments. My goal is to appreciate the work you guys did back then to bring us these games, and highlighting this kind of out-of-the-box thinking is what these videos are all about, so thank you. Doug's credited on a dozen titles on Moby Games, including Lemmings and Need for Speed Underground, so you can check out some more of his work if you're interested. Moving on to the NES, YumiLol18 asks, in the Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy, when the game starts there's a paper that unrolls explaining the story. The effect is pretty smooth, slightly looking 3D, which makes them wonder what kind of technique Codemasters used. Get ready, this one might actually make you a bit dizzy. Let's check it out. The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy was made by Codemasters and published by Camerica, and the story of their games on the NES has similarities to Tengen's that was covered in a previous video. Similar in the fact that, like Tengen, they released unlicensed games on the NES by creating their own lockout chip bypass. However, rather than trying to reverse engineer the chip's code, which is what Tengen did, they went for a different strategy and temporarily disabled it completely. They did this by including a circuit on the board that was based around 2 transistors, which essentially sent a timed series of voltage spikes to the chip that caused it to crash, allowing the unlicensed game to be played. Unlike Tengen, which Nintendo successfully sued because of how they obtained the lockout chip's documentation from the Copyright Office, Nintendo really couldn't do anything about this approach. They eventually added some additional circuitry to later revisions of the hardware that prevented this from working. These cartridges had a switch on the back that disabled or enabled this lockout defeater circuit, because the later top-loader model NES removed the lockout chip. Without a switch to disable it, these voltage spikes would have got sent to somewhere unintended and would have perhaps damaged the cartridge or the console hardware itself over time. They also made their own custom mapper, but it was pretty simplistic and did not contain anything particularly special like a scanline counter. So, to the question, before you begin the game in the Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy, you see this animation of a paper scroll with the story rolling out. The animation moves down the screen, and the effect is enhanced by showing the text upside down on the rolling part. If we were talking about the Super Nintendo, this would be easy. But this isn't the Super Nintendo, this is the, well, regular Nintendo. It did not have HDMA, it did not have its own scanline counter without a special mapper, which this game doesn't use, and it couldn't flip tiles or a tile map upside down. So what the heck did Codemasters, and specifically the programmer wizard Andrew Oliver, do here? Firstly, the screen split. The game is doing a screen split here, not by using a scanline counter, but using what's called a Sprite 0 hit. Sprite 0, as you might have gathered, is the first sprite in memory, and is kind of special because it's able to trigger a collision with the background. As long as Sprite 0 and the background have at least one opaque pixel that overlap each other, this collision is triggered, and using this, programmers can set up screen splits. I haven't really spoken about Sprite 0 hits before, but any game that doesn't use a mapper chip that contains a scanline counter would use this method if they wanted to do something like display a static HUD on a scrolling background. The original Super Mario Bros., for example, has the bottom of the coin in the HUD at the top of the screen set up as Sprite 0, and when the scanline hits this, they create a screen split so the HUD stays in place while the rest of the screen scrolls normally. This is how the Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy is creating this split. Sprite 0 is right at the far left edge of the screen. While it's normally invisible to the naked eye, Sprite 0 is actually visible as far as the console is concerned, it's just cleverly covered up. Most of it is transparent, except for a single column of pixels which is solid black, the same colour as the background. When the scanline hits this, the screen split is triggered, and it continuously moves down the screen each frame, which is what allows the unrolling animation to move. The top part, before Sprite 0, is just drawn normally, then the rolling animation is drawn after hitting Sprite 0. That was the easy part. We still need to figure out how the heck that text is upside down and scrolling in a cylindrical effect in the animation on the lower segment. So we know on each scan line, the game is continually reading PPU registers looking for Sprite 0. Once it hits it, the game executes specific code in order to set up the exact timing required to be able to calculate the positions of the scanlines below it without the need for a scanline counter. They can do this because they know exactly how many CPU cycles are in one scanline, so they set up a timed loop that takes exactly that amount of cycles. After that, a few things happen on each scanline. Firstly, the game is doing a specific PPU write that has multiple effects. It's activating the color emphasis bits all at once, turning on red, green and blue tinting simultaneously, which turns the entire palette darker, while also disabling the rendering of both sprites and backgrounds. It does this by writing E0 to register 2001. Then, it quickly fires two PPU writes to register 2006, the one that's used to set the VRAM address. These forcefully overwrite what's drawn on that scan line to effectively perform a mid-frame raster effect that reverses the vertical rendering order. The first value corresponds to the coarse Y scroll, or per tile scroll, and the second value corresponds to the fine Y scroll, or the per pixel scroll. Normally, these values would counter up as the scanline moves down the screen, but these two writes manually force it to count down instead. By feeding the PPU decreasing or inverted Y values, it draws the tiles completely upside down on the screen, from bottom to top rather than top to bottom. These writes also control whether the console is drawing the left or right side of the tile map, alternating between the two name tables every few scan lines. Why would it do that? If we take a look at the full tile map itself, we can see the right side is positioned a few pixels higher than the left side, but they are otherwise mostly identical. Switching between these two name tables every couple of lines is what creates the warping effect that gives the animation its 3D cylindrical look. It's doing all of this while rendering is disabled, so the PPU is basically blind, making this operation safe from graphical glitches. Immediately after it does this, it makes another PPU write to register 2001, this time with the value F8, which resets the palette back to normal and turns the sprite and background rendering back on. And because all of this takes less than half of the CPU cycles for a scan line, they pad out the remaining cycles with dummy instructions before starting the loop again on the next line. Once it reaches the bottom of the animation, it exits this special subroutine and returns to the main game code in order to start drawing the next frame. All of this for an animation that only lasts about 2.5 seconds that most players are going to see once. I do need to say that I wasn't 100% sure I got all of this right, so I reached out to the guy who programmed it, Andrew Oliver, to ask him if my observations were correct. He confirmed my findings, and remembered being quite chuffed when he got it working. He said he found some registers where he could change what the scan line was going to show, so it sort of became a little bit of an obsession to see if he could get it scrolling down correctly. He had it working to freeze a part of the screen while the rest scrolled sideways, so I thought, if he could do that, could he get it working scrolling vertically? He also verified that he did use clock cycles in order to get the timing right on each scan line too. As for the upside down text, he couldn't remember exactly how he did it after all these years, but thought he used some sort of weird index table. He recalled getting obsessed by little tricks and trying to show off with things like that, and took it even further with Firehawk, a game they made not long after this and released in the same year. A big thank you to Andrew for taking the time to answer my questions about this game after all this time. Interestingly, for the European release, they opted to ditch this animation and just show a static screen. I imagine this was done because they would have needed to completely rewrite the timing engine to account for the differences in the PAL console hardware, and they probably didn't think it was worth the time and effort to do so. Game Mobile 66 has a question about 3D WorldRunner, the full name of which is the 3D Battles of WorldRunner. One of its main features is the 3D floor, which had not only fully functional 3-dimensional scrolling in all the X, Y and Z axes, but also had a repeating checkerboard texture and a lot of holes that might seem impossible for 8-bit consoles with no scaling capabilities. Let's hit the ground running on this one and check it out. This is the 3D Battles of WorldRunner. It's kind of like Space Harrier, but running on foot most of the time instead of flying, and dodging enemies instead of shooting them. You're always pushed forward automatically, but you can control the speed you move at. As you run forward, the ground moves in this convincing 3D effect with a scrolling, looping background above it. Now that we understand how that previous scroll-on rolling effect worked, we can understand this, and thankfully, this is a fair bit simpler. First things first, this game is using the sprite 0 hit again in order to split the screen about halfway down. It's hiding a sprite with a tiny little single visible pixel roughly in the middle of the screen. This allows the top segment to scroll horizontally back and forth and even loop around independently of the bottom segment. Once the sprite 0 hit is triggered, the game sets up a timing loop to calculate where each scan line is. From there, it takes the part of the tile map used for the floor, which looks like this, and adjusts the scroll value of the scan lines accordingly in order to offset the image to create a repeating grid pattern. Note that it only needs to adjust the scroll values of about half of the scan lines to do this, the other half are just displaying as normal. When the player reaches certain predetermined points in the level where they need to jump over a gap, this game is also doing a pair of clever writes to PPU register 2001 to disable rendering of the background at the top of the gap and make it visible again at the bottom. For those interested, the value of 1.4 turns it off, and the value of 1e turns it back on. The scan lines these two values get written on need to adjust as the player approaches and then jumps over the gaps. While this might result in glitchy graphics on a normal side-scroller, this game gets away with it because of how it fakes this 3D movement, and when the rendering is re-enabled, it just continues drawing the checkerboard pattern on the ground from the exact spot it stopped at. Then when it gets to the HUD at the bottom of the screen, it stops scrolling altogether so this stays constant and doesn't move. This was one of the few games at the time that tried to actually support stereoscopic 3D with special glasses. Flashing image warning coming up if you were sensitive to that. If you push the select button at any time, the game will switch into this stereoscopic 3D mode, alternating between two images, one intended for each eye. I don't have a set of appropriate 3D glasses though, so I couldn't actually try this out for myself. It's also worth noting that 3D WorldRunner is a clone of the Japanese Famicom game called Jumpin' Jack, which is actually a fair bit harder because you can't control the speed you move at all. Both versions were programmed by Nasa Gabelli, who also wrote Rad Racer, another NES game that supports stereoscopic 3D and does some neat scanline trickery of its own to create undulating height. You might also recognise him as having programmed the first 3 Final Fantasy games and Secret of Mana. Vectrex28 also has a question about a different game on the platform, this time a Japanese Famicom exclusive called Tetrastar the Fighter, made by Taito. Similar to 3D WorldRunner that we just looked at, it's making some convincing Mode 7-like flaws, but on a console that doesn't have any scaling capabilities. I agree this is a great idea to have a look at this, because even though the end result is very similar, it's being done in a different way. So let's fly on in. I'll need to give another flashing image warning with this one before we get going. This game uses it extensively at times. This is Tetrastar the Fighter in action. It's a rail shooter, and as you can see, in some levels, like this one, it has an effect on the ground that's extremely similar to what we just looked at. But it's not being done the same way, and the key difference lies in the cartridge itself. Unlike 3D WorldRunner, this game uses a mapper chip that contains a scanline counter. So, there's no Sprite Zero shenanigans needed here for a start. There's 2 screen splits, one for the horizon line and another for the HUD, controlled entirely by the mapper chip. It's also doing scanline offsets on the moving ground in a very similar fashion, except once again, utilising the scanline counter to do this much more easily. However, that's not all it's doing. Unlike 3D WorldRunner, Tetrastar the Fighter is doing additional animation. You'll notice the ground patterns here are more complex than a simple checkerboard layout. The tiles that make up the pattern on the ground are actually animated, which makes the tile map look something like this when in motion. The scanline counter is then used to offset the horizontal scroll values in this segment to produce the final result we see in the game. Different levels have unique ground patterns too, so each one will be set up in a different way. It's really interesting to see how 2 different games achieved similar results using 2 distinct approaches. On a side note, you might have noticed I've been a bit vague in regards to which mapper this game uses, and there's a reason for that. It's because I don't know for sure. I haven't been able to track down a photo of the circuit board for this game, and unfortunately, NESCartDB lists the game as one that's missing from its database. The closest I found is this eBay listing for a probably unofficial translated re-release of the game for the NES by Bygone Games, a label I can find practically no information about, which does show a picture of the circuit board and we can see it's using the MMC3. This would be a reproduction and not an original Famicom cartridge board, but at the very least it shows the game works with the MMC3. The ROM header also specifies it's using iNES Mapper 4, which corresponds to the Nintendo MMC3. So I'm about 90% sure it's using a variant of the MMC3, but if anyone actually owns a physical cartridge for this game and is willing to carefully open it up to confirm what mapper it uses, that would be amazing. This next question was left by Daniel Monteiro Knit, who says that they were playing Phantasy Star II and began to wonder how they made that fade-in effect on the title screen. It's kind of weird because it slowly draws the logo a few pixels at a time. Is it modifying the tiles in VRAM? Well, there's only one way to find out. Phantasy Star II was the first game of the series on 16-bit hardware, after the original was on the Master System, and we've examined how that game's dungeons worked previously in this video. But for this question, we don't even need to start playing the game, as it's asking about the title screen, although the same effect is used in other places in the game, such as this part of the intro cinematic, and when enemies appear on the battle screen. So here it is. These 2 figures fade in first, followed by the logo. Even without debug tools, we can clearly visually see that this isn't changing color palettes or anything like that. This fade in is created by drawing pixels in each tile one at a time, as the question correctly observed. Here are the tiles in VRAM, and let's watch it again. We can see that it is indeed modifying the tiles in memory to gradually draw them, and each tile is being drawn 1 pixel at a time. But the console didn't have any hardware that could do this natively, so the question is, how are they making the Mega Drive do that? This appears to be a pre-baked animation, but one that's controlled entirely in code. I don't think there's tiles representing each stage of the animation in the ROM, because you see the same effect happen in other places in the game, like how the enemies appear when a battle starts. I doubt there would be enough ROM space for all of that, not to mention it would be incredibly inefficient. If we isolate just one tile to make things easier, and watch it slowly, you'll notice that the order of the pixels it draws isn't random. It might look random, but it's not. Each tile gets its pixels drawn one by one in a deterministic order. In fact, if we split an 8x8 pixel tile into quadrants, we can actually see the algorithm it's using. The numbers you see on the pixels in this visualizer just refer to the color palette indexes, so don't be confused by those, just observe the order the pixels change. What I believe is happening is that each tile's final graphics exist as normal tile data, but the game doesn't show them all at once. Instead, it uses a bit mask based system to control which pixel positions are considered active at any given time. Each pixel position corresponds to a bit in the mask. 0 means the pixel is still hidden, and 1 means it has been revealed. The game progressively sets these bits in a fixed, pre-computed order, writing them to VRAM one by one while keeping track of what's already been made visible. It's kind of an optical illusion, because it's technically not drawing the tiles pixel by pixel, it's the opposite. It's hiding all of the pixels it doesn't want to be visible and selectively reveals them one at a time. Because the same reveal order and the same bit mask is reused across tiles, it's an incredibly elegant and efficient solution, and it can be used anywhere they want the effect to happen. This turned out to be a lot cooler than I thought it was going to be, as it uses a trivial amount of space in the ROM and is a really nice looking effect. This next question actually comes from a well-known channel. It's Joe from GameSack. Hi Joe! I'll let you all read the full comment here because it's pretty funny, but he does actually ask a question we can answer about Gunstar Heroes on the Mega Drive. 2 questions actually, but I've already covered one of them. His first question asks about whether Treasure's logo on startup is actually made up of real 3D polygons, and the short answer is yes, it is. If you want the long answer, I break that down in detail in this video when examining McDonald's Treasureland adventure. His second question though is something we haven't covered, and that's what's going on with the Sega logo that precedes it. He says it zooms back and forth with wild abandon, like it's so full of energy and can't stay still because it has so much blast processing in it. It even gets all blocky and ugly, like Mode 7. So what's going on with this? Let's blast our way in and process this information. So this is the effect he's referring to. It's the first thing you see when you first boot up Gunstar Heroes. The whole animation only lasts a few seconds, but it starts with the Sega logo zooming out before it quickly jumps around the screen a few times, growing larger and smaller. So what did Treasure do here? Their Mega Drive games were always technically impressive. They even created real polygons for their logo. I bet they wrote some really awesome custom software scaling engine that... No, they just brute forced it. They're using different sized tiles that are loaded into VRAM, which we've seen a few times in past videos. There's so many different sizes here though that it actually uses more than 2/3 of the available VRAM. There's nothing else happening here, so they can do that. It's just an interesting observation. There was no need to reinvent the wheel for this one, I guess. Oh, by the way, as a side but related note, yeah, when I was growing up it was very common to call them Sega in Australia, and many people here still do. I don't remember exactly when I personally stopped pronouncing it that way, I just remember that at some point, I figured that since the actual company pronounced it as Sega, and they say or sing it on startup of many of their games, both old and new, that I should probably start pronouncing it that way too. I'm still calling the shortened form of the Super Nintendo the SNES though, and I'm dying on that hill. Speaking of which, let's move on to the SNES, with this question from Ando Commando 82, who says they'd be curious to know how they did the falling and leaning trees in The Adventures of Batman and Robin. Maybe it's mundane, but the way they fall and tilt vertically separately from the other trees is still pretty cool. Let's put our detective skills to the test to figure this out. You're welcome to wear a batsuit if you have one. If you're unfamiliar with this version, it's quite different to the game with the same name on Sega's machine, developed by Konami at their peak in the 90s. This is the level the question is referring to. It's the second level in the game, which has you needing to climb trees and navigate across them. When you reach the top of the area, you need to move quickly because some of the trees topple over. How are those trees falling over, and perhaps more importantly, how are the others still standing? Well, as you're making your way across the canopy, the background mode changes from mode 1 to mode 7. What helps to hide this is the fact that as you climbed up the trees, the background slowly scrolled off the bottom of the screen, so by the time you get up here, all you see is the gradient created with HDMA on the backdrop colour. So from here, now we know that the trees that topple over are mode 7 backgrounds. The trees that don't though are made up of sprite tiles. Konami really do an excellent job of hiding what's going on behind the scenes with this one. It wasn't part of the question, but while we are looking at this game, I thought it would be worth mentioning the effect of these vines that happens on the very next screen after the falling trees. Can you guess how those vines are collapsing as you walk across them? The game is running in mode 2 and using offset per tile to achieve this effect. It's a pretty creative use of the hardware. Travelling over the pond, we'll look at a Japanese Super Famicom exclusive, Ghost Sweeper Mikami Joreishi wa Nice Body, with this question from Ray VGM. He noticed that in stage 2, the background seems to be alternating between two images that look almost the same, as if they were intended to interlace or low res, which looks quite odd on a modern display. But it's only temporary, because if you progress the stage a little further, the effect turns off. So what's going on here? Investigating this one should be a good exercise. I'll see myself out. Anyway, as you can see, this game looks bright and colourful due to it being based on an anime series, that itself was based on a manga which was kind of like a Japanese version of Ghostbusters with an attractive female lead. As a result, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it's not particularly scary, nor is it trying to be, but like Ghostbusters, it can still throw some freaky stuff in now and then. Natsumi made this Super Famicom game, which sticks to the source material pretty faithfully. So this is the part of the level that the question is asking about. In the background, there's a waterfall and a weird blurring effect going on that's more noticeable when the screen is scrolling. I'm not sure how noticeable it is in this captured footage, but hopefully you can see it. So what's the game doing here? The game's running in mode 1 with 3 background layers, and interestingly, it's actually using the Super Nintendo's mosaic functionality on layers 2 and 3, which contain the rocky cliff face and the waterfall. It's only using the lowest possible level for the mosaic, which is 2x2, resulting in it being pretty subtle. It's using this in combination with colour averaging so the waterfall can be translucent. On a CRT TV that this was designed for, it would have been pretty effective. My guess as to why they did this was to create a bit more of a wavy movement on the waterfall, because the effect stays enabled as you climb all the way to the top, but then gets turned off as you walk past these rocks to find that you've now left the waterfall behind. As far as I know, there isn't a proper English translation patch for this yet, though the script itself has been translated, and I guess just needs someone to hack it into the game. Even without that though, it's a solid and well made action platform and it's worth a playthrough. I'll finish this video off with something a bit different and actually revisit something I said in a previous video. If you've seen the one where I examine the doors in the Mega Drive game Light Crusader, I say that the doors are not 3D polygons but are just animated sprite tiles. Well, inspired by some comments to that, I decided to go back and examine them closer to see if they actually are polygons that are just being drawn on the sprite plane rather than the background plane. I found this interview with Masato Maegawa, Treasure's president, and in it, the doors in Light Crusader are briefly mentioned, but it's a bit unclear. This translation on Time Extension reads like it was the interviewer that stated the doors were made of polygons, not Maegawa, and asks if they were aiming for some effect. Maegawa's response to the question is confusing, as he says, no, he tried to stop it, but there was a misconception by the developer, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me as it's presented there. I found the original article this was translated from, which was from the September 1995 edition of Game Criticism magazine, and ran that part through a few different translation tools to try to get a better understanding. It's times like this I wish I could read Japanese. What I generally got from these translations was that the interviewer's question is more like this: Notice the slightly different wording. In Light Crusader, things like the doors are drawn with polygons, right? Was that aiming for a particular effect? Now, the literal translation of Magao's response is, no, at first we were saying maybe we should stop doing that, laughs. That kind of thing is exactly where developers misunderstand/misjudge things. But it needs to be looked at in context with the rest of the interview to understand what he's saying. His answer confirms the game does indeed use polygons for the doors, but it felt like they were only using them because they should or were expected to because games were moving into 3D at the time, not because they thought it genuinely improves the game. That's why they actually considered dropping the idea entirely. But ultimately, they decided to keep them in the final game. So, there you go. There's the proper corrected answer to that one. Yes, these doors are actually real-time 3D polygons converted to tiles, just being drawn on the sprite plane, with the appropriate tiles dynamically updating in VRAM to draw the animation of the doors opening. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.